Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Enabling Hybrid Electronification in Healthcare Payments and Remits with AI. Thank you for joining us, and before we get started, I want to take a moment to just go over a few administrative details. As you have noticed upon joining the webinar, everyone has been placed on mute for the presentation. At the end of the presentation, there will be a question and answer session. So in your GoToMeeting control panel, you will see a questions box. Please type your questions or comments into the field and hit enter. Please note that the recording of this webinar, along with the slide deck, will be emailed to you following the live webinar, and we actually already have the slide deck in the handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel if you want to go ahead and download the PDF version now. But I'll also be sending that out to all of our registrants following the live webinar. But without any further ado, I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to our presenters. Joe, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Sam, and greetings, everyone. Looks like a great day today out here in Las Vegas, and hopefully it is wherever you are. We're really excited to present today's session on enabling hybrid electronification in healthcare payments and remits with AI. It's a mouthful, and we've got a pretty heavy agenda to cover. So we're going to focus on presenting a lot of really good sound information over the next hour. The agenda looks like this today. We're going to talk about some of the healthcare payment challenges based on some data points from the industry. We're going to talk about some of the efficiency considerations of payer reimbursements to providers. That'll be the focus of the payment element that we'll be diving into. The vision for full hybrid and partial electronification. We'll talk about that. We'll flush that out a bit. And then we'll talk about how new technologies have actually evolved and are available to help solve some of these challenges or problems. We'll talk about some very specific use cases, these challenges and solutions using the technology. And then we'll talk about the provider testimonials, use cases, and essentially why a variety of different organizations in the market are adopting AI technology to help solve some of these problems. So myself, I'm Joe Gregory, Vice President of Marketing at Obergraph. I'm on all of our product teams as well. Presenting along with me today is Roni Boker. He's our Director of Product Management in the healthcare line of business. And I'll be driving most of the session today, and Roni will be the subject matter expert as we go. If you haven't heard of Obergraph, we've been around since '96. We started in the check processing marketplace, moved into healthcare payment processing and healthcare payment automation, primarily using a philosophy of intelligent automation solutions. So that's enabled us to grow significantly as a company in both lines of business. And today we process billions of checks and EOBs and claims and correspondence letters across the marketplace. So that's all you're going to hear about Obergraph today. Let's talk about, wouldn't it be ideal if electronification and payment reimbursement looked like this, where a provider sends a claim to the health plan adjudicates it, and they say, hey, you know what, let's pay some of these items. And, you know, they generate a payment, they give a remit, and back it goes to the provider bank, and all is well. I think that's pretty close to how it is, right? Well, maybe not. You know, I think we've all seen different diagrams and illustrations of what the world we live in really looks like. And here's just one example of the administrative workflow that most of you out there, depending on if you're a provider or a clearinghouse or a revenue cycle company or a biller, have to deal with. You know, there's all kinds of different routing entities. There's influencers from a market perspective who are serving various functions. So it's a very complex world, and that complexity ultimately is one of the root causes for some of the challenges that we have to deal with in the revenue cycle. Now, we thought that a great reference point would be the CAQH index, which comes out every year. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. This year's report from 2019, based on 2018 data, had some great data points and some great progress, specifically in eligibility, claim submissions, and claim status. On the claim payment side of the equation, even on the payment side, there was some progress as well. 60% of the payments last year in 2017 were actually electronic, referring mainly to ACH, And in 2018, it jumped to 63%, a good improvement there for medical providers. Dental saw some improvements. And as you can see from Notch's publication of transactions, they're seeing an increase in ACH transactions in the medical field. But where the bad news is, unfortunately, was more on the remittance advice side. So when you look at, first of all, fully electronic remittance processing, where 835s are coming back from the payer to either provider or through another revenue cycle intercepting aggregator, that volume or that percentage of electronic actually declined down from 56% down to 48%. On the flip side, payer portal utilization jumped from 36 to 43% as a mechanism to help in the revenue cycle posting of remittance advices. So a huge jump there. And fully manual processes basically increased slightly from 8 to 9%. Now, another consideration here when you look at the report is that the volume of remittance advice transactions increased by 39%. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that if people are starting to use, or organizations are starting to use more manual type of processes with the payer portals and these full manual operations, and the volumes are increasing significantly from a transactional basis, which there might be some discrepancy in the data based on the sampling and so forth, you actually could be on the verge of a bit of a challenge, a bit of an issue, because you're going to have to deal with that. So kind of summarizing from a reporting perspective, the payments made some progress, but payments are influenced by economics and market influencers greater or outside of the individual provider, right? The insurance companies like to take certain positions. Some of the clearinghouses have their own products that they package. Here comes real-time payments, which needs integration into the workflow. So the payment side of the equation, there's more innovations coming along that side. I think in general, the payments itself is not as much of an issue. I think those innovations have added value to the process. Everybody wants to get to full automated electronic payments, but even if you don't, on the payment side, it's not as major of an issue. But conversely, on the remittances themselves, things have stalled a bit. We see diminishing returns of the providers really onboarding the additional payers that still send paper. So they've stayed with the paper-oriented model for those smaller payers and even for some of the larger ones. And to kind of help that cause, the payer portals have actually improved in functionality. I mean, you can more easily get a download of a PDF. And of course, paper is ubiquitous. Pretty much anyone can handle paper one way or another. So if you have to, get your data in from a posting perspective, you can still do that. So, Roni, I think this is the slide we had talked about, talking about here. Can you think of some other reasons, or do you have any commentary on why the perplexing decrease in automation adoption is occurring?
Yeah, when we look at those numbers, frankly, from Obuga's perspective, it was kind of surprising. I believe that when we spoke to the CAQH core people and the reasons that they basically told us the reasons that you mentioned, Joe. And I would say that in addition to that, I believe there may have been here some issues of potentially a slightly different mix of folks being surveyed. But I think the bottom line is what we see is that folks are looking at this EOB conversion and electronification issue as something that can be attained by other than by solutions that are right now technology can actually provide and are good enough. And therefore the move and the enrollment into EDI looks less appealing considering all the potential issues around it. I'd say that's probably the most prominent reason for that happening, and I'm sure it's going to change over the next few years, but this is where we are.
Gotcha. Thank you, Ronnie. And, I think we all realize who are those players in the marketplace, that there's a lot of processes involved when you're doing manual processing of remits one way or another. Whether you're a provider who's doing it internally, whether you're a biller or a clearinghouse or a revenue cycle company who's doing it offshore, entering the data that makes a valid remittance advice is very costly because of all these processes. So I think that highlights one of the primary underpinnings of this challenge is that there's a high unit cost or a high cost per transaction. The potential volumes are going up, and it's really a concern from the marketplace. Now, Orbograph did our own study really last year, what we presented at our client conference, and we had our own predictions. We said, what's going to happen to the claim submissions? And we predicted 62% last year and 63% this year. I think we were basically right on. We actually kind of thought that the remittance advice being electronic only, as in 835s, was going to increase. We saw from the report here that decreased. And based on even those predictions, we would see an increase in paper transactions that were being generated from the payer. And this, of course, reflects the increase in remittance advices. So if remittance advices continue to stagnate or even drop slightly more, the amount of paper in the industry is going to go up significantly. And that's going to be interesting because, first of all, providers are going to have a higher cost. They're going to have more delays in their processing. And revenue cycle companies are going to have to increase staffing, maybe even significantly, because it's not easy for them to bring someone on board to train to do these functions from a remote perspective. So industry-wise, it brings to light that, hey, we really need a vision for electronification that's realistic. And what are the scenarios here? Well, first of all, 100% electronification, the market's not going to go there on its own. The government would need to mandate something even more deliberate. I don't think anyone really sees that coming. So in the meantime, administrators, they're more comfortable with a moderate manual process approach. Hey, I'll handle these exceptions, and whether it be 5% or 40%, they're just kind of comfortable with that existing process. So in order to get to a higher level of electronification, you have to allocate resources. You have other priorities, other projects going on. So it's going to be hard to get there just purely from market-driven type of activity. Now, some of the numbers that we've also seen from a comment perspective from our clients and from the market, most of the large hospital systems seem to be around that 90+% range of electronification, but that 10% is still significant. Smaller hospitals are more like 65% electronic and 35% paper, and the physician groups seem to be 50-50 depending on who you talk to. There's a wide variation there. So how do we bring this all together so that we have really more of a strategic vision? That strategic vision is really based on a concept called hybrid electronification. We acknowledge the challenge, and we know that paper could grow. By paper growing, it means that we have to potentially solve this problem differently than how we would have a couple of years ago. And in order to do that, we're talking about technologies that deliver an electronic experience. So the benefits that are derived from this electronic experience drive a cost reduction, they mitigate risks, and they really position the organization, whether you're a provider, a revenue cycle company, or a clearinghouse, in a way to handle any increase in volume or, frankly, a decrease in volume, which reduces your unit or which increases your unit cost. So it's kind of a catch-21 type of scenario. And so having a solution based on technology helps mitigate those risks. So the bottom line is that we're trying to, I think as a market, get to a straight-through process environment, and we want to try and do it even if there's paper, if we have to coexist with paper, and we can do it through a lot of different channels, whether it be the banks or vendors, rev cycle companies. The goal is to figure out how to enable, how to empower these organizations to be able to drive a straight-through process. So that brings us to the topic of artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is really a breakthrough over the last couple of years. And that's the enabling technology to help us get to a hybrid electronification. Let's talk a little bit about why. So first of all, from an AI perspective, you've all heard AI, and this is its most general or basic interpretation of having a system that performs tasks that normally required human intelligence. And there's all kinds of different types of AI and different types of models that are implemented in AI, as you see on the screen here. So we're going to start to talk about AI as it relates to image processing, AI as it relates to payments. The second point I want to highlight is self-learning. You want to have a system that actually recognizes patterns, learns from the data, and becomes more intelligent over time. That's a fundamental aspect of AI as well. Machine learning, more commonly, that's using data to learn from, and it's improving the experience without necessarily programming. So machine learning, and then underneath machine learning is deep learning. That's an even more sophisticated way of using deep neural networks. And what you do there is you have different training mechanisms to really take advantage of it. So think about it as you're going from the outer shell to the inner shell. The more intelligent, the more sophisticated the technology can be. Now, what more challenging, of course, than paper remittances, whether it be the paper itself or a PDF? You know, traditionally we call this EOB conversion, and that was solved primarily by doing an outsource function. You ship your images one way or another off to maybe India or Korea or another country or another low-cost marketplace, and you try and get that data extracted from the paper remittances that you're receiving, or someone logs into your system. You know, that's a bit of a traditional, and it was good in the outsourcing era, but now folks are looking at it a little bit differently. And really, there's a lot of challenges with that, even with the manual conversion philosophy, because one is we have a lot of formats. Two is the image quality is suspect sometimes for these processes. Three, there's proprietary codes. There's missing data from these documents, and also the accuracy of posting becomes very challenging. So you know, when you build an AI model in a direction that has to handle something like this, you need to have some very specific targets in terms of how you do it. And so that's where we say, let's talk a little bit about a little more detail about the technology itself. You know, first of all, there's this multi-class classification model, and that can predict one or more outcomes from the data that is presented. So essentially, it's looking at the information that's extracted from the documents, and then it's learned what they look like, what the attributes are, and trying to predict what that number or series of numbers really are. Because it's not like, you know, it's an absolute. You're going to have a score based on each particular field and each particular item. The detection process is critical to this cycle with AI, because you need to detect where all the fields are, you need to understand the scope of the document, and you need to assemble that on the back end as it relates to an EDI transaction. So it's not simple by any means, and there's thousands of different EOB and different formats for EOPs. Correspondence letters kind of fall into that. So the detection process, and then learning those layouts and keeping that at a centralized aggregation point, so that you have a kind of a centralized hub that knows what all of these formats are. So when any organization who submits these paper remits or these scanned remits into the system, you know, the AI engine at the aggregation point will know what format it is, who it's assigned to, what the crosswalkings are applied, and also how to apply the best classification. And classification is really the process of using algorithms to draw conclusions on the data. So that it was trained based on the behaviors of the different types of paper remittances and PDF remittances. Now we know the characteristics of it. Now we're going to try and essentially extract everything with not only deep learning technology, but also OCR, ICR, recognition technologies. And last but not least, we're going through a process of inference, where inference is interpreting the results of every field and making sure that it makes sense for an item. So the philosophy is this: you need to have multiple components all working together, using technology for an AI layer, potentially an OCR, an algorithmic layer, which kind of helps from an image processing perspective. They validate against each other. And then there's finally a data verification cycle that is involved in this process as well, because everything is not extracted at the perfect. So you have to go through a final, essentially, quality verification cycle of that data before you create your 835 file, and even after you create your 835 file. So a lot of layers of technology, as you can see, within this solution. And Roni, I was just going to ask you, what can you say about modeling and its applicability to difficult problems like solving the issue of EOB electronification?
Yeah, this concept, frankly, of deep learning is classical for a problem like this. The issue at hand is that all the technology that Joe has mentioned before, algorithmic capabilities that have been in the market for years, all that brought to huge levels of automation that were achieved over the years, and yet left a nice percentage of the ability to automatically convert those images, complex, semi-structured, if you will, images into data, unanswered. And every solution provider has to, at some point or another, or had at some point or another, to use human addition capabilities embedded into their solution, which is not an easy one. And here comes a usage of technologies that have been there, by the way, for years, but now, thanks to all kinds of progress that is made on the hardware side and big data side, all of a sudden you have the ability to take the solution to the next level using those models, allowing those to understand patterns that were identified before but could not be resolved, and bring them to the next level. And frankly, from someone coming from at least 1 year of production, of utilizing deep learning into a solution, the results are amazing. The usage of those models brings the equivalent and many times actually a much better level of solution, or as we call it, postability or accuracy, anything you want to talk about as it comes to quality of image conversion, as I said, to new levels with models that have been implemented. So it's actually a very classical usage. As long as you have two things, you have to have the right models in place, and you have to have the access to well-tagged, large volume of examples to, if you will, feed the beast. And if you do, you're in good shape.
Great. Well, thank you, Roni. That gives us a little more detail on that. I think another consideration, frankly, is the deployment model or the deployment approach. You need a solution that is easy to connect with. It enables or empowers virtually any organization within the stakeholder food chain to be able to utilize it. So whether you need to plug in at the provider level, whether you need to plug in at the lockbox location, maybe a BPO can use it, or a revenue cycle company, the clearinghouse, by the dynamic of having a cloud-based deliverable, and then using that as your centralized aggregation point, where all of these layouts and all of the intelligence of the system is learning and learning and learning from multiple samples, from multiple multiple capture points, multiple clients. The system just keeps getting smarter and smarter over time. So ultimately, I think technology is a great place today, but even a few years from now, I think it's going to be amazing, and there's even going to be some of those exception processes that we're encountering now will go away. So if that concept could actually be applied to workflows, what are some of the challenges that are solved by essentially what we call operationalizing AI. And some of these are traditionally concepts of benefits that folks know about. If you're managing an operation that's doing processing one way or another, where you have a lot of labor involved, it's obviously that you're going to cut your manual posting costs. If you're talking about $3 to $5 per transaction, that could be a very significant amount. And even if you don't, eliminate those positions and you redeploy them, the old adage of redeploying to more value-based functions certainly applies. The accuracy levels should also increase, when you compare machine versus human. Now we're at the point where machine is better. So hopefully from that perspective, you would see a benefit in your postability, which ultimately affects customer or patient satisfaction. And best practices in posting, everyone wants to get to EDI 835 files. So when you do this hybrid environment, you're actually getting to 100% electronification. It's just that a subset of that work was actually created through a different process as opposed to natively from the payer. Now, correspondence letters, those are a bit of a thorn in the side of many organizations because it's a separate item that gets mailed from the payer. The provider or the biller has to handle it manually. It goes into these backlogs, which can be potentially days on end. It's not a very effective process. It's unstructured data. This is an area of streamlining as well from a technology perspective that you can address with the solutions like this. And the beauty of this is that once you get the data extracted from these originating paper or PDF documents, now you can actually use it. Whereas before you have to go retrieve the item either manually or just as a scanned document, which has no indexing of the data on it. Now you have all the data in a database, and you can essentially use this as an electronic content management system. So research, operations, client or patient questions that come in are all much more readily available when you have a system solution like this that incorporates an archive across your enterprise. And last but not least, go ahead, Ravi.
No, just to interject on this one, correspondence letters, as many of our attendees know, are very much the last bastion of paper in that complete paper in the medical world, in the medical payments world, if you will. And for that type of document, again, deep learning capabilities, at least for indexing and more than that, are amazing and are right on time in order to resolve those and actually convert those. Many payers actually utilize correspondence letters in lieu of 835s or in lieu of EDI, and literally that's the only way for a provider to learn sometimes about a denial. So the ability to electronify, if you will, here in a consistent and accurate fashion is priceless. Sorry.
No need to apologize, right? That's a good point. And actually, when you get all of this into your electronic content management system then, and you streamline the process, these data feeds can also help reconciliation. And, we all know that the ideal scenario of reconciling payments and remits would be, practically speaking, like an EOB. You got the paper and you got the check attached to it, you reconcile, you're done, right? We know that the electronic side is not like that. And actually, there's more like 9 different or 10, 12 different scenarios that can happen because, you have remits that are coming in that are 835s and PDFs and paper. And then on the payment side, you have the virtual cards and the ACH and the checks. And there's a few other options dealing with, zero pays and, other options that may be incorporated, credit card, etc. So the reconciliation process is actually expanded. So by extracting data and standardizing this data set, you can feed it into a reconciliation system that you have and streamline that process as well. So of course, it all kind of rolls back up into reducing receivables and improving cash flow. That's the ultimate goal. But underneath it, there's a lot of individual workflow and a lot of benefit areas that feed into that ultimate business justification. Now, one of the dynamics, of course, with moving into a hybrid electronification environment is that you want to make it easy, right? You don't want to have a 1-year conversion that costs you, $100,000 just to get there. So I think that with the technology and the platforms that are available out there, that's one of the beauties of it, is that you can go online, you can sign up for this service, you can minimize the paperwork involved, make a variety of different decisions with the onboarding process. There's some overwriting of the claim defaults with customer-specific values that can be done. So the main benefit here is that the transition time to full electronification can actually be done very quickly, whereas in the past, that has not been the case. So that's one of the beauties of leveraging technology to provide this functionality. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer back over to Roni, and he's going to talk a little bit about proprietary codes and crosswalking.
Right, and this is just a small example here, but the idea of utilizing AI and advanced technologies to recognize what's on the image comes to a great example when it comes to proprietary codes. Many of the payers, instead of utilizing standard CARCs and RARCs, as folks know, in order to justify or adjustments that they make to the payments to the providers, are utilizing long explanations like the ones that you see before. The ability to read that explanation is not an easy one. If anybody has to key it or anything like that, that makes errors very, very easy. And if this is just an example out here, sometimes you look at a specific verbiage, and if you don't read it correctly, you may make a mistake. You make a mistake, you put it under contractual obligation, for instance, instead of potentially, or the opposite, on patient responsibility. Those little mistakes, if not corrected and identified quickly by automation, like the one we're showing over here, can actually lead to different workflows and lead to mistakes downstream. So providers know very well the implications of such mistakes in terms of the ability to recognize revenues, in terms of the ability to timely appeal decisions of the payers, and more, if AI and advanced technologies are utilized accurately in a good enough fashion, as we said before, this streamlines, electronifies the process and makes all the downstream processes a lot faster. So I can talk a little more about it. We have once you do identify, obviously, the proprietary codes, crosswalking those into ANSI and actually manufacturing a very good 835 becomes easier. As I said, improper translations can be very costly, but frankly, many of the providers can translate from verbiage. Okay, but those translations, by the way, are not easy. They're not well-documented solutions, advanced solutions like the ones we're talking about here, that would recognize the verbiage off of the image and automatically translate them into the correct ANSI trios. They make the change. They actually are the pieces in the puzzle that allow for correct translation of adjustments. And as it says here, you bring to you much higher level of user satisfaction versus situations where wrong translations can actually be very, very costly. So again, advanced solutions can utilize AI to read and understand what the adjustments are, and even some solutions allow for the users, for the providers, to actually influence and translate their own way, if you will, and not just the default translations as the system provides. This is just a comment on availability of such systems. Go ahead.
Great, thank you, Roni. And we talked about data, and then you have to look at how can you use that data. Now that you've extracted it from the documents, there are other systems that could use it downstream. And what no better than denial management, right? Denial systems. So the question is, how are you managing your EOB denial data now? So denied claims that come back to your EOBs, and how do you manage your correspondence data? Many times we are hearing that this is isolated information. Once it gets entered into the PMS system, that function has completed the posting part, but there's other analytic systems downstream as well that could use this information. So by doing the data extraction process, having a common file format that can be ingestible in these other systems, you can actually add a lot of value into those workflows. Business intelligence has been around for quite some time now. I think at HIMSS probably 2 to 3 years ago, that technology just exploded on the marketplace. Reporting and so forth has been around, but now you can use BI for so much more. You can do it from an operational perspective and monitor your transactions. You can use it from a research perspective, from a reconciliation standpoint. You can have the system actually send ad hoc reporting and email delivery, so you don't have to log into the system. The receivables analysis, from each one of your payers, and really diving into the details behind each one, looking at trends and patterns. And this is really one good way to analyze the sources of your non-electronified transactions, and then doing some analysis on those to see if it would actually be worthwhile to try and get native 835, or just send them to an AI-oriented hybrid environment, and do a comparison between the cost-benefit ratio. So that's the beauty of using this data downstream. And that brings us to the final scenario of Sam wanted us to address some of the different use cases of companies who are out there who are using this technology. How are they applying it to their operation? What are the benefits, etc. So first of all, let's talk about some large banks. Banks have been in this space for quite some time. And really, one of the main benefits is that they want to expand their treasury management offering, their medical lockbox services. It's a very sticky type of deliverable. Once you get someone who's processing with you in your lockbox, and if you're processing their paper remits, it's very difficult to leave. Not only from a conversion perspective, but also it's hard to get the payer to keep changing the direction or the delivery location of those documents. So from a bank perspective, it fits extremely well, when you're the aggregation point of paper remittances and correspondence letters. It fits the workflow really well. One of the challenges with this is that the customer expectations across the board are high. The banks are very sensitive to accuracy of information. Clients, of course, want their banking services to be 100% accurate. So you must have a quality deliverable for this marketplace. And that's where, of course, we've talked about how AI can help from an accuracy perspective. A lot of times banks have been, it's been difficult for them to overcome the sales objections that they're running into. But recently, I have to say that a number of these large organizations are just killing it in the marketplace. They've got their messaging down. They understand the benefit and the return on investment, and they know how to talk the talk now. Those organizations who know how to do that and cross-sell other banking services are really successful in the marketplace. Others who don't know the nuances, they're having issues. So last but not least is the compensating balances component. That's a value proposition to both entities. It's kind of a win-win because the banks play with that as an attraction perspective. The providers also like to manage around that from a fee perspective. So that's a tool for both sides of the equation that can be very powerful. Case study number 2 is the clearinghouse market. We've seen that a lot of clearinghouses want to integrate processing these paper remits into their remittance automation solution. Right now, many of them don't touch remittances. They only touch the claim side. So this is a value add to them. One of the challenges for them is actually getting that lockbox address changed, though, if they are indeed going to be the interception point. But many times the providers themselves are actually uploading scanned images of the paper or PDFs to the cloud. So that kind of gets back to the ease of deployment. The clearinghouse has a couple of different options here in terms of deploying within their workflow and within their customer base. Most of the time you can overcome these workflow challenges. One other thing I just wanted to note is that the clearinghouses typically are more oriented towards marketing, being a marketing organization. So they have campaigns, programs, departments who are set up to help market and sell services such as account-based marketing. So when they customize their message to the end user provider, and they do it with a strong combination of marketing, account management, and sales, with technical expertise, which is strong, that can be a very strong message for the clearinghouse market. So they can certainly take advantage of this technology and be very successful with it. The last example is really revenue cycle companies. You know, these quote-unquote biller on steroids. They have a lot of different services that they're providing. This gives them some additional diversity. It is a logical extension from a product offering. Many of these are offering, you know, BPO services. So using AI to streamline those processes for not only themselves, but also for the client can be a very powerful benefit. And, you know, as we referred to earlier, if the paper volumes are actually increasing, that means that these organizations are going to have to add staffing. And frankly, the hourly costs of many of the offshore countries has increased now. So it becomes more and more difficult from a competition perspective to hire the low-cost data entry functions. You're looking at having to manage very large numbers of people as well. And so the revenue cycle companies can use this as an aggregation point and as a streamlining process as well. Last but not least, the revenue cycle companies many times are already getting the volume one way or another. So to them, you know, this type of platform, hybrid electronification strategy is really good because it complements what their existing customers are already giving them. So that basically concludes our session, Sam. You know, we've talked a lot about the challenges of the market, the workflows, the deployment of AI, and essentially how to achieve a hybrid electronification environment. So we're open to any questions or comments that the audience may have right now.
Thanks, Joe. Well, we have a couple questions that we can get started with, but make sure if you have any questions, you type them into your questions box, and we'll start addressing them. So the first question we have: how can providers, RCM companies, distinguish between production level AI versus AI disguised as business rules or hard-coded approaches which look like AI?
Mm-hmm. I'll take it, Joe. So first of all, this is a good question, and frankly, oftentimes we are, you know, being posed, okay, you are just adding to a long list of folks turning to us, talking to us about AI. What is it that you have that is different? How can you distinguish it, and how can we tell that you have it? First of all, obviously you need to be able to tell by the results, but that's not the way it works. You need to ask key questions, and I would put 3 questions that folks need to answer to when they are coming and offering solutions that do involve AI. First and foremost, what models are you actually basing your solution off of? And, you know, one can frankly pretty quickly tell if the result or the answer is one that is a serious one, relying on, you know, familiar CNN, DNN, RNN models that are in the market, or you know, not sure, and so on and so forth. A second one, which is critical, again for utilization of AI, is all about volume and the ability to basically teach a system. So the question would go to something like, can you tell me how you can actually teach the AI models that you have? How do you do it in reality? How do you use vast, huge, millions of samples how do you have access to those in order to teach the system? This is critical. And the last one is actually a methodology of tagging results so that the system can learn. And again, you need to listen carefully and understand whether or not the vendor in front of you knows what tagging means, what and how they actually teach the system on an ongoing basis. Do they have a methodology for learning and retraining the system? These are all key questions, and frankly, not too many people have the answers to those.
Thanks, Ronnie. We've got another question that's come in. What are the advantages of using Clearinghouse for providing EOB conversion?
Okay, I'll take that one as well, if possible. So Clearinghouse, frankly, is almost the ideal situation, if you will. Sometimes, if you think about the workflow, clearinghouses are the ones that are in charge of the communication between the providers and the payers. First of all, on the exchange of the claim information, the 837s or equivalents, going from the provider to the payer, and of course, on sending, receiving the 837s and the other pieces of information back from the payers. So for them to be able to embed into the outgoing into the 835 data that is coming back to the provider, embed EOB converted images converted into 835 is ideal. It seems, and it actually makes payers, small payers and others that still utilize paper and have not converted into 835, in a seamless fashion, they become converted into 835, which means that the posting percentage is a lot higher from that clearinghouse's service. So that's one point, and I think clearinghouses understand that. Another one, clearinghouses today provide a lot more than just those services of exchanging claims and remittances. Many times they offer a wider solution of a wider array of solutions for their providers. And lo and behold, if you are missing 50% of the remittances in your information because they're not 835 based, you can't provide real denial services. Then, so that's another reason for clearinghouses to enjoy, utilize, and deploy solutions for EOB conversion, part and parcel with their solution to the provider.
Thanks, Ronnie. And if our attendees have any other questions or anything that's popped up, any comments or questions that you would like to make, feel free to put those into the questions box now so we can get those taken care of. But I'd like to thank our wonderful presenters, Joe and Ronnie. Thank you for joining us today in this incredibly informative webinar. We certainly appreciate it. And just so all of the attendees know, again, I will be emailing you the link to the recorded webinar in case you'd like to share this with any of your colleagues. And I'll also be sending you the slide deck if you have not already downloaded it from the GoToWebinar control panel. Joe, Ronnie, do you have any wrap-up thoughts that you'd like to share?
No, just thank you very much for the opportunity. And if you have any other questions, just certainly let us know.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Of course. Thank you. And I hope everybody has a great rest of their week.